Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Angles and Attitudes. As always, my partner, John. John, how you doing?
Hey, Mark, how's it going? We're going to have a great one tonight here.
Hey, that handsome gentleman you see below us, you probably may not recognize his face, but when we start the interview, you will definitely recognize his voice. Sports Chicago radio reporter, sports phone, and now a purveyor of his own podcast, George Ofman. George, thanks for joining us, and welcome to Angles and Attitudes.
Hey, George.
It's my pleasure, and I can tell you that most people have told me over the course of my 48-year career, I do have a great face for radio.
It's funny you should say that, because many have said the same for our wives have said the same for John and I. But it's always interesting. We've listened to you for so many years on The Score and on various other platforms to hear that voice, and you're like, oh yeah, that's the guy in the car when we were driving to work, and he would be going back and forth with Terry, with Terry Boers or with Bernstein or with, the Heavy Fuel Crew or those types of guys. So it's really a pleasure. We mean that sincerely to have you joining us today.
Well, believe it or not, it has now been 13 years, almost to the day. I think it was maybe 10 days earlier than this that I left The Score. So in between, there was 10 years at WBBM. There was 10 months at WGN, which included a nice trip to Philadelphia to watch the Blackhawks hoist the Stanley Cup. So time flies.
It sure does. And we had seen, and we won't stay on The Score, obviously, but the other day, Tom Shear was on, and it's like 30 years since the inception. That's
30 years. Yeah, January 2nd of 1992 is when The Score came on the air. And I'm always fascinated to look back and see the tremendous success of not those of us in front, but those of us behind the camera or behind the radio and the microphone, people that were producers like Jesse Rogers and Judd Surratt and Matt Spiegel. I mean, they have really sprouted into tremendous journalists and broadcasters. And so I admire that more than anything else, is to see the guys who were younger than us. Because when I started, I was 38. Mike North was 39. Jiggs was in his mid-30s or something. So, we started there when we were already, with the exception of Mike, we were already 15, 20 years into a career.
George, for the few shows that were on at that time, did you think, with some of the names you've mentioned, because at that time, 1992, the 30-some years ago, did you think it was going to take off?
Well, I mean, there were doubts, some, but we were all focused on trying to put out a product with people that didn't know other people. I mean, Mike North was kind of the X factor, because a lot of people didn't know him. He was not part of a media group, although he did do a bartered program for Dan Lee's, one of Dan Lee's stations for a couple of years. It was a gambling program. Imagine that now, 30 plus years later, he's doing the same thing, only he's doing it with WMVP. But the rest of the guys I knew, the problem was that the rating system had us really inaccurately rated. And so there would be this feeling of depression when you saw numbers that were lower than they were expected. Yet, the bottom line is people were talking about us all over town. And because of that, you got the sense that I think we're on the ground floor of something pretty good. And as it turned out, it was more than just good.
Well, and to your point, you found that the passion was so deep, and to this day, right? You have a bad Bears game, and all you got to go through is whether you're listening to OB and Hamp on WGN or just go down the dial. And I ask you, sometimes a losing Bears team was way better radio than when they won, right?
Oh yeah, no. You got all the angry folks that came out when teams were not doing well. Right. If they were doing well, everybody loved it. But what's the criticism for? It was like Joe Madden in Game 7 of the World Series against the Indians. People were wondering about his strategy and everything else. They're on pins and needles and biting their nails and everything else. So of course, when the Bears weren't very good, but then remember at the beginning, we had some incredible analysts. We had Mike Ditka, Doug Collins right off the chute. Mm-hmm. You can't get much better than that. And that was a tremendous draw for us.
And I thought that all of you brought something to the table, you know, something different that, like you said, everybody around town, if it was in a car radio or you listening to it in the morning or in the afternoon, it was like, okay, what's Ofman going to say? What's North going to say today? We were looking forward to something.
Well, it's nice to know that. And it was also nice to finally expand. Remember, the station began as a daytime station. So you started in the winter and you were starting at 7:30 in the morning. You were off at 4:30 in the afternoon. Of course, as the season progressed, by summertime, you're on at 6 o'clock in the morning. You're off at 8:45 until finally we got, you know, to 11:60 and then 6:70, and it's now 24 hours. But yeah, it was fascinating to be part of that group. You know, to be with people like Dan McNeil and Terry Boers. I've said this before and I'll say it again. I think Terry is the greatest talk show guy in the history of our city. And that's really taking in a lot of very good people who are on the air today, because Terry was able to combine integrity and incredible wit. I mean, he was really funny. And anybody who listened to the station realized Terry could get me going to the point where I was in such tears I couldn't even talk.
What Terry did, he was kind of at the start, as you first are introduced to him, a little bit of an acquired taste, but over the course of time, you were able to gather the sarcasm and the wit and interworking his newspaper background and all of those types of communication things. And I think on some level, there's still some really good people on there now, but there was a level of, like you said, sophistication or professionalism that not everybody can hit anymore. And just, you know,
I don't know. I'm going to disagree with you on that. Okay. I mean, I think that the station today has got some really, really very good, talented people. You know, David Haw has made a great transition in his position. Dan Bernstein has made transitions for himself. You know, when he was with Terry Boers and Layla Rahimi, and now he's going to be basically solo, to Danny Parkins, who's really a very good talk show host, very bright. He's very quick. He's confrontational, but he's not confrontational to the point where you'd say, man, I can't listen to this guy, and matched beautifully with Matt Spiegel. And then there's Lawrence Holmes. That's a very good group of people over there. So I wouldn't discount any of them.
I think that the question will roll back a little bit. You were talking about being behind, you know, the scenes or that, and the producers and all. You, like you said, I could sense the pride, like a coach. Right. My team and some of these guys that were when they were, you know, in the peewees or bantams, to use a hockey term, and now here they are on their own. So there's got to be a sense of pride, right? Being, like you said before, I remember when they were just, when Speegs was just doing, you know, a little bit of baseball or what, you know, Terry Boers used to call them what, meat pants. And now Meat Pants is doing drive time on you know.
Well, not only that, but he's a very accomplished musician as well. So he's a multi-talented guy. It's just, you know, the station has evolved, and it's 30 years old and it's still going strong, which is, and it's nice to know that you were part of the very beginning. I was hired on my birthday, December 28th, 5 days before we were on the air. And the other guy who was hired with me was some fella named Greeny. I don't know, Mike Greenberg or somebody. I don't know.
Yeah, we don't know what happened to that guy.
No. The only difference between him and me is, you know, how many zeros are in his paycheck. He's got a few more than I do.
Yeah, just.
George, was that right after Sports Phone that you got hired, right? Was that after Sports Phone?
Sorry, fellas, I didn't hear that.
No, I said, George, you got hired right after Sports Phone for that? Right after Sports Phone?
Oh, no. I was only at Sports Phone. I was also I was at the beginning of that as well. Just like 6 weeks after that began in 1977, I joined that on Christmas Eve with Fred Huebner taking me through the ropes. But I was only there till the summer of 1979. I was thankfully fired because I began freelancing, and then I had a freelance career that lasted 13 years. I was on my own completely. I loved that part of my career. So it was 13 years before I started at The Score, and actually about a month before I was hired, turned down an opportunity to do talk radio in Toronto, which was, you know, a wonderful opportunity, but I gambled to stay in Chicago and hopefully be hired by The Score. But and when you mentioned Sports Phone, I mean, the alumni of Sports Phone is a basically who's who of Chicago media. Just about everybody worked there. Just about everybody in New York worked for New York Sports Phone. So it was a great stepping stone and the perfect timing for a lot of people who progressed in the broadcast business, because it was just really, the radio broadcast business was just exploding in the late 70s and the 80s and 90s.
That's yeah, like we said, we're just north or south of 60. So those starting your full-time job and going to work, you're in the car doing a 9 to 5, and you pick up, you lock in on that, and you're running to your radio every day when you get in your car to find out, what someone was saying, or, what did North say, or, what was Ditka like that day after a loss. And as you said, the skill set of those people, but that was important, right? Because the Chicago sports fan doesn't want, lied to is a strong word, but right, they want to hear the truth. And they want to hear it from people with some credibility. So that obviously was very important with, Jiggs, and then Ditka and Collins and all of those type of guys, right?
Well, there was some credibility already. I think you had Tom Scher, you had Dan McNeil, who had already worked in several years with Chet Kopic. Terry Boers had done, I think, some radio prior to that. So there was some built-in credibility, but then after that, it was an acquired taste. And the guy who really tied it up was a guy that most people never heard of. His name is Mike North.
Well, we had Mike on. He did, I think our interview, he did 30 something minutes, and it felt like 5, because that's all John and I got to ask questions.
Yeah,
that's Pappy. Likes to talk a lot.
It was like, go. I was like, whoa. And then John kind of just winked at me and said, stay out of his way. And I said, fine.
Yeah, was it hard to get guests in those days, in those early years, George? Was it hard for like the professional athletes to come to the show? Did they say, okay, hey, how did that work in that era in the beginning?
It was tougher, I think, for the regular producers to do that. But I was immediately in the field and covering spring training, 6 weeks after we're on the air. And I remember approaching, and we had those huge block cell phones. This is before the little cell phone. These are big suckers, weighed about 5 pounds or whatever. And I'm approaching people like Ryan Sandberg and Andre Dawson, and they're saying, I'm not going on that station, because they were already listening. Or if they weren't, they were being told what was being said, and they said, and it was tough. It was not part of the job that I particularly liked. It was part of the job that you had to do. But as time went on, there were more people that actually enjoyed doing it because they were athletes who listened.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that at that point, it's not those, like some of the stuff you might see or hear today, but you guys were looking for content and let people express themselves and share that, and in their own way. Some of those players over the course of time built their brand. And like you said, 2 guys that were very clearly not necessarily camera hogs or mic hogs were great players, like Dawson and Ryan Sandberg, right? Just let me do my job and go about my business, right?
Well, but then there were some receptive people. I think Frank Thomas for a while was very receptive, and then he became the opposite. He was praised, but when he got criticized, Frank, became a wallflower. And there were some people who didn't want to do it, but some people who really enjoyed it. They really enjoyed the repartee. So I didn't do a lot of talk then. I did some fill-in talk. Until we did the baseball show. I think that started in 2004 or 2005. But I think it was, it just took time for people to recognize this was the first all sports radio station. And then there was WMVP came, I think, a couple of years later. So suddenly there was competition, which I think made the Score a better radio station.
But it was competition, but there was a lot more. That ESPN at that time had a lot more the national programming on. You had that Greeny guy in.
Well, no, not this. In the early going, they did local programming. I don't think that Greeny wasn't there until 1996,
Okay.
So in the beginning, that was, I mean, I don't think Greeny did his radio show until, oh gosh, in the early 2000s.
Okay.
So they had a group of local people that constantly changed. You know, they had some people in the field. And so there was some legitimate competition between the two stations.
For a local station, it took off like fire. I mean, it was a fireball because, like you said, all the different personalities, all the different talk. And then, of course, you had this ESPN that you would watch at night. That's how I looked at it. Listening to the local, watching the ESPN, you know, they kind of clubbed together at the same time.
For a lot of sports fans, I imagine that was the case. I know that I was out covering a lot of games. So, you know, I was constantly busy and on the go, whether it was at that stage, Sarasota at the beginning, then Mesa, then suddenly I'm in Pittsburgh for the Stanley Cup Finals. And so I was moving around and around and around. And listen, it was a great experience to do all of that traveling. And then I did it again later when I was on the baseball beat. So this is 2003, and suddenly I'm covering the Cubs down the stretch in Pittsburgh and Cincinnati. And then they make the playoffs and they win their first playoff series in Atlanta since 1945. Also a very interesting, you know, position to be in. And then eventually the White Sox, and traveling, gosh, I don't know, 4 or 5, 6 different cities and winding up in Houston where they swept the Astros. So it was a wonderful experience for me in that I got to experience championship sports. You know, I got to experience a White Sox World Series. I didn't get the Cubs World Series while I was there, but I got some pretty good, you know, playoff games and things like that. So it was always a really good experience to travel, to cover locally, to anchor there, and of course, that people will remember, to coin the great phrase, a towering line drive.
Well said. Well said. So, you know, we had Wayne Larrabee from the Packers was on a couple of weeks ago. And
it's interesting, excuse me for interrupting, interesting to note, but I'm finishing I did an interview with Wayne in, I think it was July, for our podcast. I still haven't put it out. Okay. And I'm talking to Wayne tomorrow to kind of freshen things up. And then we'll put out his podcast sometime. It'll probably be a year before it comes out.
Wow.
Just because sometimes those things will happen in the course of combining so many interviews with all of these people that basically most of them will hold because there isn't much change in their careers. But in the case of Larrabee, when we did it in July, a lot of changes. Aaron Rodgers, Devontae Adams, the Bears, and all of their changes. And so you do a little freshening up, but it's interesting. I'll be talking to him tomorrow morning.
So a lot of those you piece together then, George, to what you're saying.
Not a lot of them. There are very few that get that kind of treatment. I did that with Hub Arkush. I think those would be the only 2. Otherwise, some interviews I can turn around in, say, a month. Some of them might last. I'll give you an example. Kevin Harlan, who I interviewed last April. So it's 2020. And I was going to schedule him in June that year. And I realized, you know, he's not part of the NBA's playoffs after the first round. Why don't we save this interview? It's a 2-part interview until the Super Bowl, which of course he does for Westwood One Radio. And he was great. I've known Kevin for 40 years. I knew Kevin when he first started out of college, hired to do the first ever pre, post, and halftime radio show. This was for the Kansas City Chiefs, and he was still a sophomore or junior in college. And that's how I got to know him back in 1980. Wow. So some of these interviews, you know, man, I think we're running Pat Cassidy next Tuesday. Pat, of course, the longtime anchor at WBBN, WMAQ, did 51 years of Morning Drive. That interview is just a month ago. We're turning that around and running that next week.
He's a wonderful guy. We were fortunate enough to interview him like a month or 2 before he retired. And that was one of the ones we've done, maybe close to 50 now, John. That interview with him surprised me a lot more than most of the other ones, because not that his personality doesn't shine through as much when he was on, at 6 o'clock in the morning or whatever, but very warm and, good storyteller, great sense of humor, just kind of came across as just like one of the guys. And it doesn't necessarily seem that way when he was on the radio, but very enjoyable nonetheless. But back to Larrabee, one of the things that he made a point of was his first year with the Bears, they won a Super Bowl. And he looked back on it now, and it was like, not that he regretted, but wished to have been able to be there a little bit with the climb. And you talked about some of those teams with the White Sox, and as the Cubs developed, to be able to kind of go, well, they were here and now they're here. And there was much more maybe enjoyment or excitement or appreciation for what happened in that respect. Did you find that with some of the stuff that you did as well?
Well, are you talking about the Bears in particular, or
no? Just like the White Sox or the Cubs, is that climb, the playoff run to get to Atlanta and some of those other teams.
Well, sure. I mean, but I've seen the ups and the downs over the course of 44 years in this marketplace. To teams that looked good and they weren't good, and teams that should have been good that weren't. But yes, to see the climbs. I mean, the White Sox in the early going when we started, remember we started in 1992. The White Sox were a division champion in 1993 under then Tony La Russa. I believe to this date, and I haven't talked to Tony since I've been off the radio now for nearly 2 years, but I believe I am the only media person now around that was around when Tony first started with the White Sox back in 1979. And it looked like they were going to be a championship team for a number of years. Remember, 1994, there was the strike. And I was just discussing that with a future guest, Darren Jackson, who, of course, is a longtime radio and TV voice for the Chicago White Sox. So you saw that climb. The Cubs were just kind of like 1984, I should say, with, of course, that was, now I'm dating myself before the score. Their team in 1998, wonderful team with Sammy Sosa, who was, of course, on his performance-enhancing drugs. We don't have to argue about that. I think we know that for a fact. But they didn't really do anything. And then comes 2003, the remarkable run with Dusty Baker, and the unfortunate disaster that took place both in Miami and at Wrigley Field. Not in Miami, actually, they came home with a 3-1 lead, and then they fell. And really didn't do kind of much after that until 98, or was it? You were talking about 2007, 2008, or 2008, 2009 when they won.
With divisions with Pinella, yeah.
Yeah, when they made consecutive playoffs and went 0-6. So yeah, I mean the ups and downs. Atlanta was great. Atlanta was, that run that the Cubs had. In 2003 was the likes of which that one game 5 in Atlanta, which was Yom Kippur. I was asked, do I want to go cover the game? I said, are you crazy? Of course I'm going to go to Atlanta for game 5. It's one of the most memorable games I've ever covered, because the game was the largest crowd in the history of the Braves, which included Boston Braves, Milwaukee Braves, Atlanta Braves. There are 54,000 people in Turner Field, and there were far more Cubs fans. I would say there were well over 30,000 Cubs fans. I thought I was at a Cubs home game. I was remarkable. The whole scene in the locker room, watching Kerry Wood spray champagne outside over Cubs fans. It was really just an incredible, wonderful experience to see that happen. And then the disaster comes, and 2 years later, there I am in Houston, where the White Sox are vanquishing the Astros in 4 games. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's great to be part of history. It's great to be a journalist that's part of that kind of history. And then 4 years later, I'm at WGN, and I'm only there for 10 months. And here's game 6 in Philadelphia, and they're asking me, George, this is 24 hours ahead of time. George, would you like to cover game 6? I said, let me think about it. Yes. What are you, nuts? Well, I'm part of the broadcast team. So as they go to overtime, we are sitting in the hallway, those of us who are part of broadcast teams, because whoever wins, we're allowed on the benches within 30 seconds. It was the Blackhawks. And there I am on a bench, mind you, watching a Stanley Cup being hoisted right by me. It was a very surreal experience. It was fabulous to be there.
I can't even imagine. And that was the beginning of that stretch too for Blackhawk fans where, but again, you're talking about the ebbs and the flows, and it seems like it was only yesterday and now the big playoff hole, and here we go again with 3 to 5 years worth of rebuild, and
yes,
it goes the other way again.
That's the one thing, and that's been the biggest problem, I think, with other than the Bulls, who had that sensational run. And yes, I was part of that with the score and Michael Jordan. That was a great run that really started with Michael Jordan and got better and better and better as you went along. Otherwise, there really hasn't been consistency with the other franchises. The Bears were a good in '84, and they won in '85, and they never won again. They were really good, but they never won again. And the Cubs' consistency really began with the Joe Madden era with Theo, and they had 5 years. Unfortunately, they made the National League Championship Series 3 times. They won 1 World Series, but that was a disappointment. Look where they are now. They're kind of in a rebuild mode. And the White Sox, for the first time in probably, I don't know when, have a consistently good team. They made the playoffs twice. They should make the playoffs again this year. They're going to be challenged. So in the course of history, there's not been that consistency that some cities have had, like Boston. Hey, when you got the Patriots, but the Bruins have been very consistent. The Red Sox up and down, but they win World Series. The Celtics, and that doesn't happen in Chicago. You just have to get used to the fact that if there's an up, it doesn't last very long, and then there's a down.
George, so tell me a story I don't know. We'll talk about your podcast, which is taking off fantastic. People love it. I love it. Mark's been watching it. Tell us a little more now about Tell Me a Story I Don't Know.
Tell Me a Story I Don't Know is in its second year. It is it's an audio only podcast that involves top storytellers with connections to Chicago. And so we have had a flurry of very, very interesting guests, from our original guest last January, a year plus ago, which was Michael Wilbon, a Chicagoan. And if you follow Michael on Twitter, he's going to have his say particularly about the Bears and his Cubs. But in the interim, we've had people like Greedy and Steve Stone and Sarah Kustok and et cetera, et cetera. And all of these wonderful people have great stories to tell. And in particular, some of them just happen to be great storytellers. People like Dave Wanstadt, Dan Plesac, Dave Refson. They're just incredibly good storytellers. Yet there's never been a poor interview. Everyone has been fabulous. Tell Me a Story I Don't Know can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. They come out every Tuesday. We are currently running Dan Rowan, who has been at WGN TV now. This is his 38th year. He's going to retire this year. It's kind of, we're running this sequence of guests that are either retired or will retire. We had a 2-part series with Pat Foley. Pat was great. I was here when Pat walked in the door in 1980, and here he is now. He's going to walk out the door. And then we're going to follow Dan Rowan with Pat Cassidy. So, and today, what am I doing before I did this for about 4 hours? Editing an interview with Jeremy Roenick. There's a guy who's had quite a history, and a very checkered history over the last couple of years. So they're all fascinating people. We have upcoming interviews. Matter of fact, I don't know, it was like about 3 weeks ago, I interviewed Ron Rivera, the head coach of the Washington Commanders, who of course is a member of the Chicago Bears Super Bowl team. Sure. We're going to be talking to Lisa Byington and Cassidy Hubbard. So there's a lot of interesting people. All these people either worked here or grew up here. And that's the whole part of Tell Me a Story I Don't Know. But it's all there. It's about them, and they really shine. And if you say the interview is going to be 40 minutes and you're looking at the clock and these guys have gone past an hour because they can't stop talking. Mike North was one of those guys. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I was done with Mike North, it was an hour and 20 minutes. I said, two parts, same with David Kaplan. It's like, how am I going to edit these guys? We do it. We find a way.
Well, yeah. How do you get a word in edgewise on Kaplan? Because once Kaplan gets going, you're just you're along for the ride, right?
Well, yeah, because he tells long stories, but so did Eddie Olczyk, and Eddie is great. They tell extremely long stories, but that's part of it. You know, I can do that with you guys now, and I just did, because it's like a faucet. You open the faucet, you let the water run, and it's just going to keep running and running and running until you turn off the faucet. I don't want to turn off the faucet. The stories are wonderful. Yes, afterwards you got to figure out, okay, how am I going to fit this all in and do the editing, which I find a way to do. But they're just, you know, they're wonderful, because I think when the interview gets going, they realize this is mostly about themselves. And when you're talking about yourself, you can talk forever. Steve Stone. And Steve, not only a great interview, he's hilarious. Yeah. And that's another part of this, is that you get entertainment. Some of these people are very, very entertaining as well. So I appreciate every interview that we've done, and I hope that the audience continues to grow. We've done fairly well in that department. And so, you know, sky's the limit with Tell Me a Story. I don't know. And we've got a lot of people that have already been interviewed and scheduled for our summer season. And so I'm always ahead. Like I said, sometimes these interviews get shelved and they're not heard for 8, 9, 10 months, but they're there, and they wind up getting downloaded sometime.
It's amazing, because I'll tell Mark before an interview, I just got a call, let's say from Chris Myers. Mark, only 30 minutes. All right, John, 30 minutes. And then Mark the next day or right after the podcast, I thought you said 30 minutes. We went an hour with the guys. So, but again, they have so much to tell.
Yes. Well, I mean, that's part of it too, but you're leading them. And once you lead them, they'll usually come up and say something like, oh, here's a story I've never told before. And I'm thinking, good, that's exactly what this is all about. And you're fascinated. I love that Dave Revson, who's just a wonderful guy and a great host of the Big Ten Network. I mean, he told an unbelievable story about how he got hooked up in a golfing group with O.J. Simpson. It's an incredible story, and he tells it with such verve, and you're listening to it. I must have listened to it like 50 times as I'm editing it, because it was a great story. And that's just what Tell Me a Story is. It's fascinating. It's part of somebody's life, but it's also entertaining as well.
No, and you hear things. We interviewed Bill Clement, and he's been great enough. We might be able to, we're fingers crossed, we're going to talk to Doc Emmerich in April. And again, those, you see where that kind of that bubble, like, you know, they talk about the dog's face where he kind of tilts his head and then the light goes on. But you can see that in the guest when they catch that story that they haven't told in a long time, or they refreshed it, and it brings back some memories to them. And there have been some moments where he brought some stuff up, some dark stuff where some things went bad financially, and he you know, got a divorce and had to pick himself up, and you're like, wow, was not expecting that. And then in the next segment, he's telling us about how Steve Durbano butt-ended their trainer at a face-off, and they all looked one way at the puck and they looked the other way, and the trainer had all of his teeth knocked out by a guy on the ice as he skated by. So you're right, they just go and like you said, an hour later, you're like wanting more. Do we have to, you know, do we have to stop?
Well, when you interviewed Doc Emmerich, who I had on last May, just talk about the early days when he used to go stand in line to get a ticket at the Chicago Stadium. He grew up in Indiana, and he used to come to the old Chicago Stadium back in the 70s. He is, I mean, as I think when someone called Marv Albert, who was one of my early guests, actually, we had him on when he retired, the soundtrack of the NBA. Well, certainly Doc Emmerich was the soundtrack of the NHL. And he is a great interview. He's wonderful. He's so enthusiastic. But when you hear his voice, it's just like, please keep talking, because I love to hear the sound of your voice.
Well, we did that with Wayne Larrivee, because that voice comes on and you're just waiting, and then boom, you're like, there it is. I recognize that. It's comforting, because I know that's Sunday afternoons.
Yeah, there is. There's the when you're listening to these people who you've listened to for years, you know, same with Bob Costas, who, again, luckily I've known him for 40 years. Bob, the light goes on, and he is just told some spectacular stories about Dallas Green and the Sandberg game. But it is that voice, and you're listening to it, and you are just mesmerized.
Yes.
because you are talking to them, but they're telling you stories. And that's the best part of Tell Me a Story. I don't know. By the way, as for Marv Albert, we'll have his son on in a couple of, probably in May, Kenny Albert, who I interviewed, I think, late last year. So we'll have, I think it'll be the first time we have a father and son.
Wow.
So George is throwing down on us. We got to figure that one out well, we're going to go with father and daughter-in-law. We're going to, Gino Cavallini, who coaches at the Mission and played for the Blues. His daughter-in-law was the starting goalie for the women's U.S. team in the gold medal game. As a matter of fact, he owes us an extended interview because he goes, guys, I got to get home. We got a watch party. So
the United Olympics, yeah.
Part 2 with Gino, and we got to get his daughter-in-law on there.
All right, there you go. That'll work. That's a good idea.
And yeah, I mean, just we were, nervous, if you will, but once you get people, like you said, talking about themselves, and sports people are just genuine and really want to share and can tell how dialed in you are and how important in a lot of those situations, right? Those stories that they will share also were somehow connected to you. If it's Sandberger, we talked to Mark G and Greco and silly stuff about like the New Year's Eve things with Janet Davies, but those were all the things that we remember and he shared, and I don't know. And I guess I want you to, if we'll put you on the spot, can you tell us a story about Chet Kopic? Because there's always good stories about Chet.
Well, Chet was really, he was very generous to a lot of us as we were beginning our careers. And he reached out. I think for him, the idea was, if you got a little talent, let me see if I can weave you in. So when Cheryl Ray Stout now, was his producer back in the 80s, and he was doing the Kopic on Sports, I would be on his show as I was covering Blackhawk games. And it was nice. I was, doing my freelancing, and Chet was one of my clients. And so he was engaging in the fact that he wanted to have as much local radio people as he could have on. And a lot of people, I've talked to them, owe their careers to him. Kenny McReynolds really owes his career to him. Kenny was another one of my guests, and said how Kopic really helped him. Dan McNeil, Dan was his producer and realized that as he was growing, it's time for me to shed Chet. Let me see if I can find something, which of course was the Score. So
tell me something dangerous. Tell me something dangerous.
Yeah, right. I mean, the one thing about Chet though is he was always scripted. I mean, his whole show was scripted. I don't know if people realize that, but he, every one of his questions was right there, prepared for himself, but it's fine. He was able to do a good job of, interpreting everything that he wanted to say. He had a very interesting style. He was a man who liked to wear fur coats. I think we all said he had a very big ego, and then it was sad to see how Chet left us, just as it was not that long ago when we lost Les Grobstein, who was going to be a guest on our podcast. He agreed to do it, and then we lost Les. So another incredible character over the course of time, a guy who I sat in a press box next to, whether it was the White Sox or the Cubs or the Blackhawks or the Bulls, for over 20 years. Believe me, I got a lot of Les.
George and Mark, I got to tell you, George, Mark and I have found out, like, sometimes we have a guest and sometimes like, well, I wonder how this is going to go. Does this happen with you where you're going to interview this guest and without mentioning any names, and all of a sudden this guest that you thought maybe wasn't going to be the style you thought winds up being an unbelievable interview? Have you had that?
I'm trying to think of anybody. I think I've had a few interviews where I thought the interview was going to be really good and it turned out to be average. I'm not going to mention those names, but I did an interview with, I feel terrible now. The umpire, awful, local umpire here is Major League umpire. And forgive me for not remembering his name, but at age 68, I don't remember what happened,
Come on.
at dinner. And, and he was a wonderful interview. And the more I listened to it, And the better it was. And so he turned out to be a better interview than I thought. Not, I'm trying to think if anybody turned out to be better. When you're done with it, you usually think to yourself, wow, that was really good. So maybe more often than not, you have high expectations and then they're raised afterwards. Ron Coomer was wonderful. Wow. Not only the stories he told, but the heart that he put into those stories was just great. You know, you could feel that emotion that was coming from him. So I think that all those interviews, when I'm done with them, I usually say the same thing. I said, man, that was a great interview. And I'm not kidding. You know, it's like, so you think the interview should be really good. And it turns out to be almost all of them better than you thought.
We can appreciate that. And obviously not with the professionalism that you do, but we will immediately after an interview, we'll call each other and go, that was way better than we thought. You know,
well, you had Gian Greco. I mean, but Mark was one of those that I interviewed before we actually dropped the first podcast, which was January 26th of 2021, which I believe was the 35th anniversary of the Bears winning the Super Bowl. But a number of those interviews, of course, had to be prepared ahead of time. Wilbon was, Marv Albert was, Gian Greco was. Well, we wanted to drop Gian Greco right after he was fired, but we had to wait. And Mark asked us to wait because there were some legal issues. Sure. And I've known Mark and I'm a friend of Mark and he's just great. What you see is what you get. Yes. There's no fit. He's the same person on the air as he is off the air, which is really great. He's a wise ass from hell, but he's funny as hell. And so finally, we were able to get the permission to do it. And to this day, he is still the guy who drew the most listens that we've ever had. Wow. And yes, we talked about Janet Davies. And yes, we talked about everything. Mark is great. Yes, First of all, he's been an edgy guy for all of his career. And unfortunately, that edginess cost him his job, which it shouldn't have. Very creative, came in this market in 1982. And he was second behind Chet Kopic, and then Chet got fired. And so here's Mark, who grew into this. I mean, how many guys can do this for 39 years? He did it for 39 years. Dan Rohn did it for 34. You're never going to see that again. Jim Rose, I think, has been on the air for 40 years. Those days are gone now. You know, we're not going to see that again. But the good part about that is I've been part of that with them. Mm-hmm. I've had the opportunity to interview them for the podcast, and it's a real pleasure for me.
Oh, no doubt. I mean, Mark's the guy that you're just like sitting around chatting. John said, give me here's his phone number, call him, see what dates are available. And we talked for 20 minutes on the phone, and that was the first time I talked to him. Like we were old buddies, and both John and I are hockey coaches, and our kids played hockey. And we started talking about which rink we were at, which team, crazy hockey moms, the whole bit. And it just rolled. And he was so nice. We had Diane Burns on a couple of weeks later, and he jumped on and surprised her. We just called him, can you jump on? And he came on and, did his shtick there too. But, again, it was just so, remember, he told a story about coming from Buffalo and people not knowing his name. And they're like, what are you, some sort of Puerto Rican or something? Because Gene Greco he was. And it's just, that's just him. And it really is. And like you said, it's not, obviously people can read it as offensive, but it's genuine. That's who he is. He's not making anything up or trying to do stuff. That's just who he is. And that's what was really neat about being able to interview him as well.
Yeah, well, that's what made him successful. And I bother Mark now and then. He really needs to continue in some capacity. I know he's tired of television, but he still has a lot to offer. And I hope he finds that conduit to still be part of the media consciousness, because we need him. You know what I mean?
No doubt.
We need more Mark Giangrecos.
100%. We got to get the t-shirts going, John.
Yeah. No, yes, for sure.
His time with Waddle and Sylvie, when he would jump in on Tuesday afternoon, neither one of those guys, like you said, Terry makes you cry. Those two guys were just blubbering idiots, just laughing for a half hour, and he would just keep rapid fire keep coming, and it was great radio.
Well, that's, he's irreverent and it works. It works. He should be doing 5 days of radio, but you know what? Mark can do whatever he wants. He's earned it.
That's for gosh darn sure. He said he just wanted to be a grandpa for a while the last time we talked to him.
Yeah.
I said, how do you argue with that? So how do you argue with that? All right. So we've talked about all of these stories, podcasts, and how long it takes. And we're at a point now where we're going to bring this one to a close because we went way farther than we thought we would too. The tradition we have here is John's the goalie. So we end our last question comes from the blue paint. So John is the goalie. He gets the honor of closing the show and having the final question for George.
Hey, George, it's kind of a twofold thing, but I got to ask you because just loved hearing all the stories during this time that we've been out with you. But here's my first one, and then I'll give you the second one. The first one is, I'm only going to give you 3. Give me your top 3 moments where maybe a week or a day doesn't go by that you've covered here in Chicago that you say, wow, like you mentioned the Stanley Cup thing, but what are your top 3 moments that you covered? And then I'll give you my second half of that.
I think I mentioned one of them, which was the Cubs in Atlanta. I was there covering Pete Rose as he tied the hit record at Wrigley Field. It's a great story behind it because, so this was a Saturday, and Rose was not going to play because he's a left-handed hitter, and at that stage, he would rather bat. Let's see. Now let me get the story straight. So Steve Trout was pitching, okay, and he's a switch hitter. He decided he just wasn't going to play that day against the left-hander Trout. I'm just trying to remember the exact part of that. Well, Steve Trout before the game was on an exercise bike, and he fell off an exercise bike. Couldn't pitch that day, and so Rose put himself in the lineup. And what I remember about the day was it was an ominous day. It got windy. It got dark at Wrigley Field. I don't think it rained. And it's like a movie. And Rose tied Ty Cobb's record. And, he still played. It wasn't like he took himself out of the lineup. He still played in that game, but he did not play in the Sunday game. And of course, he broke the record the next day. That was really incredible to be at that particular event. So now I have to pick a third
one. Yeah.
A third one.
And it's not this podcast, so you got to take that up.
No, that's going to be number 4, by the way. So I'm sorry you didn't make the top 3, guys. It just didn't work out that way. For an event to be there, well, I will tell you that one of these, I'm going to put them together as 2. One of them I covered, one of them I was a fan. And I know this, I think I could be pretty safe, is that I'm the only person on the face of the earth to have seen these 2 games. The highest scoring game in NHL history, and the highest scoring game in NBA history. The highest scoring game in NBA history was in Denver in 1983. My college roommate was a news reporter there. I went there, I visited him, we went cross-country skiing. He said, look, I got 2 tickets to the game tonight against the Nuggets. I said, I don't want to go to a game. I see enough games. He dragged me to the game, and that was the game in which I think it was the Pistons beat the Nuggets 186-184 in triple overtime. Think about those numbers, 186-184. 2 years later, I'm covering the Blackhawks losing to Edmonton 12-9. Highest scoring game in NHL history, highest scoring game in NBA history. And my biggest problem is I had the score sheet and the ticket to the game. I can't find it. I've got everything because I'm sitting there saying, eBay, guess what I have? Well, I can't find it. So I'm gonna make those as my combination of number 3.
And last thing for you, besides me and Mark, who are the top 2 people you hope to interview in the future? And tell me a story I don't know.
Well, there are people.
2. You only got 2 that you're hoping for.
Well, hoping for, I can't. One of them I'm not going to get that I hoped for, which is Brent Musburger. The family just didn't want him to do this. And at age 82, I finally got the understanding that he wouldn't. I've tried. I've not succeeded yet. One of them is Jason Benetti. who I would really like to interview. And the other one who I'm really working hard to get and want to is Porter Moser. So these are people I want to interview and I hope to interview. But the ones that I, unfortunately, and listen, you have a list, and sometimes people won't do it. Greg Gumbel wouldn't do it. He just was very open. He said, I really don't want to do these things. And the same thing with Brent Musburger. I'll do a real quick one with you. Marv Albert wasn't going to do my podcast. And I've known Marv since 1979. I did stats for him while he was with the Knicks. I did stats when he was with NBC. And he said, George, unfortunately, I just don't do podcasts. And I was crestfallen that he wouldn't do it. A few days later, maybe a week, calls me back. He says, George, I just got lassoed into doing a podcast with Mike Greenberg and Bob Costas. And since I did one with them, I'm going to do one with you. And he did.
George, I'm going to tell you, and this is how I close it. Thank you for doing one with us, because it was a thrill tonight for me and Mark. When you said yes to me a couple of weeks back, of course, I always run to my buddy Mark, and I told him, you're not going to believe who's going to be on, George. And I really thank you, George. Mark and I truly thank you tonight.
My pleasure, fellas. Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks. Stay well.